loneliness is like hunger. All it is actually a social cue. I need connection. And all that loneliness is a little alarm bell in your head saying, time to reach out, time to reconnect, time to maybe find new friends.
Jemma Speg is someone everyone in their 20s needs.
Point you say friendship is more important than romantic relationships in your 20s, or can be more important.
If friendships go to the wayside because of a romantic relationship, it can be actually quite detrimental to a person's ability to grow into a well-rounded person. It's like consuming just one media source.
Just try something and realize that just because you have invested in it to begin with doesn't mean that that's going to be the rest of your life.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the Loaf Podcast, where we interview the world's most interesting individuals to promote critical thinking and open discussion. Today, we're here with Jemma Speg. She's a mental health advocate from Australia and notably hosts the hit podcast, The Psychology of Your 20s. Jemma, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys. I feel like it was so hard to get a time that worked for everyone, so I'm so glad that we figured it out.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we made it work. But anyway, we're going to get right into it. So the idea of the quarter-life crisis, I think, is kind of what undergirds your work for the psychology of the 20s. And it's kind of a play, obviously, on the midlife crisis. So maybe you could begin by telling us how the quarter-life crisis is different, what kind of problems you think define it, and so on.
Honestly, Ollie kind of just like opened my eyes. I'm like, yeah, the whole basis of my work is the quarter life crisis, but I had never really thought about that. You're totally spot on. I think the big difference is obviously quarter versus mid. We're so used to this like typical idea of a midlife crisis where it's a fancy red sports car, it's an ear piercing, it's like a young wife, or like just like a divorce. Like you just have this major turning point. And I think it really comes from this like existential sense of like, I've been living my life one way for so long. What am I going to do with this next half of my life? But the quarter life crisis is so different because it happens so much earlier, right? It happens in our 20s. But what people don't realize is that there are equally so many of those existential questions at this age, and they feel so important because there is so much emphasis and pressure placed on this like period of our lives, right? So the questions often revolve around like, what do I actually want to do with my life? What actually makes me happy? Who do I want to be? What kind of relationship do I want to have with myself, with others? Like, it's just this period of confusion, but it's also this period of transition, much like the midlife crisis, where we're kind of entering into this new phase and we're halfway stuck in the old phase, halfway panicked by how far ahead we should be in the next phase. That's where like the crisis really, that's the crisis point right there.
Yeah, it's interesting that the midlife crisis is like such a cliche, but then the quarter life crisis is only just a play on it, which kind of suggests it's more of a new thing. Why do you think the quarter life crisis is new, whereas the midlife crisis is something that's, you know, kind of almost overplayed?
Oh my gosh, it's such a great question. I honestly don't know, but I do think that it's because we're kind of feeling the pressure in this generation, right? Like previously, you kind of had a bit of a blueprint for what you were meant to be doing in your 20s, right? Like it was very stereotypical. It was very traditional. It was, you know, maybe go to uni, get a trade, finish high school, do something educational, skill-based, then get married, start a family. And there were these certain like economic goals that weren't as difficult to kind of hit, right? Like buy a house or like get your parents to help you buy a house, like pop out a few kids. And it was very structured. And it's such a blessing that obviously some of those structures that's not the only choice that we have anymore, right? There's so much more freedom and inclusion, but it also means that you're kind of left to really forge your own path. And have you guys come across this term? I'm sure you have, called choice overload.
Not actually. Could you explain that?
I'm going to explain it, and I think that you'll be like, oh yeah, I totally know what you're talking about. So it's basically this idea that when you have too many choices, it actually doesn't provide you with the more freedom as we would think. It actually makes you more confused, and it creates this like decision fatigue and this overload of like, okay, previously, you know, if I had to choose between an apple and a pear, there's like a 50% chance that I'm going to make the right choice. Even if I'm completely torn, I'm still going to enjoy one of these. Okay, then I want you to choose some, like every single fruit and vegetable that exists in the world at the supermarket, and you can only pick one. And it's kind of like, well, I've just got so many more pro cons to add up, and it's going to take me a lot longer. And a lot of the time people are less satisfied with the decision because they're like, well, look, I'm constantly comparing to this other fruit that I could have had. That is what life is like nowadays. Yes, there are no longer just two options. There's millions, unlimited options, but actually that makes us feel even more restricted because there's more pressure to choose the right one and there's more comparison between them. And I think that also really contributes to this newer idea of the quarter life crisis for sure. And I'm sure you guys have probably experienced choice overload. Like normally I tell people about it and they're like, hell yeah, totally.
Yeah, I just graduated from Oxford, so Ollie's still got a year left. I just graduated and it felt not only a choice overload in terms of what I wanted to do as a job, but also in terms of which country I wanted to live in, right? So I'm like, do I want to move to London? Do I want to go back home to my family in Malta? So I think, especially with globalization, there's just so much choice that it becomes hard to know, as you said, what the right thing is.
Globalization is a huge one, right? And it's so funny because you normally don't talk about that in psychology, but it is the sense of like, there's just this huge dispersion and there's just this huge expansion of possibility that is great, but also can be super, super like overwhelming to decide what you want to do.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's a bad thing to be lost in this day and age, or do you think it can actually be like a learning experience?
I think it ends up being a learning experience, but like in the moment it feels terrible. Like so many things. It's like heartbreak, right? Like in the moment it absolutely sucks, but then like give it a year and you're like, nah, that totally needed to happen. Hindsight is like the most beautiful thing in the world. She like makes everything clear. And I think that's the same with being lost. Like in the moment, it's like, this just sucks. I want to know what's happening. I want to know where I'm going. I want to know who I am. It's like all in time, because if you knew who you were right now, if you knew exactly where you were going, who you were going to be with, who you were going to be full stop, where you were going to live, like it's not exciting. It's not exciting and it's not much fun. And so you kind of just have to lean into like what you said, Lucas, like sometimes the benefits of that discovery period, because it's like not everyone has that option as well. I think that makes it also so much important to focus on. Like it's a beautiful thing to have so much choice that you feel lost within it.
Want your head and hair to feel cool and clean? Been going to extreme measures to cool your head off? Then get yourself a Manscaped. Don't be like Ollie and take your scalp from zero to hero with the new scalp buffer now. Use the discount code LOAF to get your 20% off.
Yeah, that's the thing kind of about losing the traditional structure of job, marriage, etc. is that even if you do, and it's not just really about choosing the right path, you know, in one specific time, say at like 22, it's also that you may not have that path until 28 the same way. So it's actually the fact that that choice overload kind of lasts for a lot longer. So I guess my question is, what kind of strategies do you think people should be using or ways of thinking about being lost and having choice overload in order to help deal with that before they do find that path or that way they want to go?
I would say just like give everything a go. And like, you know, you guys started this podcast. Like I love when people start podcasts because I'm like, it's actually a great way to just like figure life out by coming on and like thinking about your life, thinking about ideas, meeting cool people, like whenever you can. Obviously, like my biggest piece of advice is not go and start a podcast, but it did kind of encapsulate in the broader idea of like, just try something and realize that just because you have invested in it to begin with doesn't mean that that's going to be the rest of your life, right? Like I think that's really what scares people with choice overload is they believe that committing to one path means that they're committing for life. And we don't recognize that actually you have so many seasons of life. It's like, if you think about the last 2 years, think about where you were 2 years ago. How much has happened in that time? So much. Like Lucas, you said you graduated. Like now you're in this whole new chapter. Like life is not just this one big chunk of years that spans out in front of you. And once you're locked in on a railroad, like a railway track for your future, like off you go. See you at like death's gate, right? Like there's choices within that I think you're still able to make. So I think that's my biggest piece of advice is like just explore. Don't feel locked down to anything. You do have agency to change at any point if you choose to do so.
Maybe to push back slightly on that, what do you think about maybe, for example, situations where you have to decide really big things at, for example, 17, I want to go study medicine. And then after 5 years of studying medicine, you've got this sunk cost, right? You've put so much time and effort into it that to change from there, in some sense, it is almost that you've set yourself up for quote unquote life.
Yeah. Well, I get that point, and I also get it's so much money, right? And you're right. It's like the sunk cost of like my family may have spent everything to get me here. This is like a great job. This is a great way to pay them back. But is that the only thing that you can do with that degree? Is that the thing, like, can you not be creative within that? I think it's like, and I will say, like, in a lot of life situations, obviously, like, you're going to have to make hard choices and you will have to give something up. And I think that is a great example of that, Lucas, of like, okay, do I want to give up my future freedom, or do I want to give up these 5 years, I'm saying in quotation marks, like, there is always going to be a choice inherent within that. And you really have to like sit back and think about your values, right? Because if the only reason you're going to continue doing something is because you're worried about disappointing someone, or you're worried about the years that you've already given, it's like, well, there are many more years in front of you that you will eventually have to give. And if you took a different direction now, in 5 years' time, you'd be like, oh, thank gosh, I did that. And there are many more people that you will disappoint in life. Many. So it's like, okay, get a head start. Like, do it now while it's like when you first experience dissatisfaction. I think that's a good time to do something. I will say, like, with privilege in mind, obviously there's a lot to be said about that. And I get pushback sometimes, like saying this stuff and people being like, well, like that's not accounting for low income. But I think it does, because you adjust based on your circumstances and what's available to you in your country, in your job, in your uni, where you are at.
Yeah, the privilege point is definitely interesting. Maybe we can get into it a bit more later, but just to stick on the idea of choice for the moment, for those who have it, I feel like the kind of other aspect of choice, and maybe this is what brings about the quarter life crisis a lot, is that in having so many different paths, people used to converge a lot more, staying in whatever village you were, with friends and everything. And I think whether you see your friends a lot or not, the ability to have that choice and to go down different paths means you can often end up being a lot more lonely. And I don't know if you think that's maybe one of the biggest things that people are struggling with as a result of choice overload and globalization and all those other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, did you grow up in Oxford, Ollie, or are you from a different part of the UK?
I'm from, I don't know how well you know the UK. I'm kind of like an hour out of London, a different part to Oxford, basically. Just countryside, basically.
Yeah. And Lucas, you said you're from Malta, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure when you guys first moved to Oxford, it would have been terrifying. And I'm sure that you've probably lost contact with a lot of people you knew before I don't know if it's a 4-year degree over there. I'm assuming it is 4 years.
Mine's 3, Ollie's is 4.
Okay. And this is what I think. It would have felt really, really lonely to begin with. And everyone like experiences that at some point, maybe even 2 years in, probably feeling lonely for you now, Lucas, like about to be in this transition point. But I think that in that point is where you actually are able to readjust the relationships that you have in your life. And it's so funny that you bring this up, because I was watching this program, like I'm an 80-year-old woman. I was watching this TV show called Last Stop Larimer, which is based in Australia. And it's about this town. And there's only 11 people there. 11. And one of them ends up being murdered. It's this whole drama. It's a true story. And these people have known each other for ages. And I do feel the attraction of like, oh, I want to know the same people for my whole life. And we've grown up together and it's beautiful and it's gorgeous. And these people were like, had so much friction. It's like, I think it's a grass is greenest in like mentality, where it's like, oh, the good old days were so great. And then you know, at the time people were probably like, I wish I could just escape my small town. That's probably why a lot of people a lot of younger people did move for more opportunity. But definitely like loneliness in this day and age, like what did the World Health Organization say? It's like almost an epidemic, like an emotional and like a mental affliction becoming an epidemic that we know has like long-term health consequences, and not just mental health, like physical health as well. Like it's huge. It's huge. It's so harmful.
Yeah, I think it obviously has so many negative consequences, but something that I found really interesting in your kind of approach to it, which I think is kind of the unique way of looking at it, because most people go, oh, well, I'm lonely. Okay, how can I embrace connection, see friends more, this and that? But you say that it's not necessarily something to run from, and that it can actually tell us something. Can you tell us a little bit more about that maybe?
Yeah, it's so funny. I was just writing something about this, and I know I said it was horrible, but it's a horrible feeling. But actually, loneliness is like hunger. It's like thirst. Like all it is actually a social cue. It's not a social cue, like an evolutionary cue. Like it's a cue of like, there is this thing that I really, really need. I need food. I need water. I need shelter. I need connection. And all that loneliness is a little alarm bell in your head saying time to reach out, time to reconnect, time to maybe find new friends. And I actually think that's really, really valuable to be in tune with that. The other reason it's really valuable is when you start to notice that you feel lonely, even when you're around people. It's like, something about my need isn't being fulfilled here. Because if it was merely the being surrounded by people cured loneliness, like you go to a shopping center and you'd feel great. No, it's like the emotional depth of certain connections and the intimacy and the vulnerability. And so I think that loneliness in that way is actually a really great way to assess your life and to assess. It's like, I don't really know how to explain this, but it's kind of like, yeah, it's like, I don't know if you guys have like carbon monoxide detectors. I know this is a really strange analogy, but it's like, that's what loneliness is for like your body. It's like, okay, there is something about the situation in my life that like isn't making me happy. And also it's like, I hate when people are like, well, it's normal, so why should you fear it? It's like, well, death is normal. Illness is normal. Like it's still scary, but it's also kind of inevitable. So you have to have you have to find a way to make loneliness fit in your life and in your mind in a way that feels appropriate and like healthy, if that makes sense.
There's a bit of a balance that needs to be struck, because there are obviously people who have this chronic loneliness, there are people, of course, who are very little friends, who spend every weekend at home alone. And then in that case, I think it can be really detrimental to mental health and can lead people down really dark paths. While on the flip side, you've got people who are in general have good circle of friends, good support network, but might feel occasional loneliness, in which case that's a good breeding ground for growth. And from there, I suppose the question is how we can cultivate a healthy habit of spending time alone and how we can find that balance.
I really like that you made that point, actually. I have this saying of like, solitude is so sacred, and if you never learn how to be alone, you'll always be dependent on others. And I think that when you start to apply that to your life, it makes so much sense, right? And there was this really interesting paper I was reading the other day, particularly about people who feel loneliness and their tendency to stay in bad relationships. And I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory, but people who are like, I'm afraid of being alone, it's like, will often also be the people who are like, I just spent 4 years with someone that I didn't even like because I was so terrified of what it would mean to have to just like experience life without company. So I do think that like solitude and a respect for solitude is a muscle that you can strengthen. I had this friend who used to do, what did she call them? Like recharge. I don't know what she called them. Basically the premise was like she would go away for a weekend and spend the entire weekend alone. And I don't know if this is a healthy way of saying it, but I remember this stuck with me, where she was like, I like the fact that I've trained, like, she's like, now I know that I never have to stay in a relationship or stay in a friendship or even stay in a job or in a city just because there are people there that I like. And that makes me a lot more untethered. But she was like, it also means that I am better able to understand like which relationships I actually want and which relationships are truly nourishing, because I'm not just rushing to them for a cure to my loneliness because I'm terrified of it. So yeah, I think it's a good practice to like spend time alone, to find ways to like integrate solitude into your life. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as a weekend, but even like an afternoon.
Yeah, I think the romantic relationship one, particularly for people kind of at our age, often from like 16 onwards, it can be super easy. I've been a little bit guilty of it as well, to just kind of be in a relationship and kind of let it dominate all other relationships and that kind of thing. And part of it is running from loneliness and just always having somebody to speak to, always texting, always being on the phone. And friendships kind of maybe sit often at more of a distance just because there's multiple and they're different.
So true. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, because obviously, everyone has different sets of friends, different commitments. So you can't just sit on the phone with your friend the whole day or text them the whole day. And you can't be like, oh, what? You're picking them over me. Whereas a friendship to a romantic relationship, somebody like your girlfriend could be like, oh, why are you, talking to them? But anyway, on that point, you say friendship is more important than romantic relationships in your 20s, or can be more important. I think a lot of people intuitively maybe wouldn't agree with that. So can you explain your perspective maybe on that?
Yeah, and I get it. Because I used to be someone who was like, no, my 20s are for finding the person I'll marry in my 30s. Duh. Like, and you have to really think like, why do I think that? Because I do think that if you're going to be with someone for the rest of your life, if you meet them at 30, there's a chance you spend 50, 60 years with them. And you might not get this time in your 20s, being young, being maybe untethered, to make those really, really core social relationships that are going to last a lifetime. And here is something that I've noticed. 30 and up, like, people are always going to, I guess, want to find a romantic partner, right? There is always a drive there. There is always an opportunity. If someone is single, like, they're always going to have time to be single and to date you because they don't have a partner. But the thing that does tend to be a lesser priority, like a little bit later on, is friendship, right? And I think that's where people really rely on earlier memories and earlier experiences to really make up for it. I also just have to say, like, once you find, if your whole thing is like a pursuit of a relationship, once you get it, you realize that it can still be incredibly lonely. And like, that's speaking from experience, where it was like, oh my God, I just remember when I was younger, maybe like 4 years ago, I was like, oh no, like, all my friends have these partners. Like, that's something that I want. And then you get there and you're like, okay, well, actually, one person is not all that a life needs. Like, you need community. Like, we are communal creatures. And so I do think that, like, this is such an opportunity in your 20s when everyone's kind of on the same page, kind of in the same boat. Most of us don't have kids. Most of us, like, especially in our early 20s, most of us don't have these huge family commitments, to actually just like make great friends. Hopefully that's a good justification. Hopefully I've convinced some people to stop like chasing after situationships or whatever.
I think it is a good justification. I think it's a fine line, again, as many of these things seem to be, in that I feel like there does come a point where, at least in my experience, from what I've observed, that having romantic relationships can be really beneficial if it's the right person. But at the same time, if friendships go to the wayside because of a romantic relationship, it can be actually quite detrimental to a person's ability to grow into a well-rounded person, because you've only got one perspective. It's like, I've just come up with this analogy now, but it's like consuming just one media source, right? You always get the same perspective. Whereas if you've got lots of different friends and maybe different circles, you've got lots of different ways of viewing the world. And in that sense, I think a relationship should perhaps be one out of many human relationships, rather than the one that it's, from in a meta sense, one relationship above all others.
I love that. And have you heard this question? This kind of reminds me of this question of like, would you rather make the love of your life now, but never make any more good friends? Or would you rather 20 amazing, great friends who last the rest of your life and to never find love? There is no right answer to that, but it's interesting to see how people's values align and like what they intuitively choose, because mine is intuitively like friendship for sure. But then other people like, and I'm saying this as someone who has a long-term like partner who like we live together, like, you know, his is like, oh no, I'd rather have like you. And I'm like, yeah, of course I want to have you. But like they didn't have, I'm like, oh no, this isn't me breaking up with you in like a weird philosophical question way. That's so cruel. But it's kind of like, yeah, but if I could have you or 20 friends and I could only choose one, like, I'm really sorry. I'd rather have you as a friend, if you know what I mean. Like, so it's interesting to see like how you answer that intuitively, like impulse, like from an impulse position.
I think for me, I don't know. In one sense, I feel like I've been pretty lucky with my friends so far. And I feel like as much as I'd love obviously to have 20 more great friends, I could be fine with the friends I have. So maybe
found a way around
I have enough friends.
Yeah.
I always say that.
Yeah. So maybe I'd probably lean to relationship. I don't know. What would you say, Lucas?
I think it's a tricky one. I was lucky enough in that my girlfriend at the moment, we were friends for 2 years beforehand. So I've kind of experienced both with her. And I think that's an interesting way to set up the relationship, in that I think a lot of healthy relationships have, when partners are together, they're also friends. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky one, because one, I think, common issue that people face is that when they're in relationships, they often, as I said before, then tend to meet their friends less. And one non-negotiable piece of advice that you have or you've given is that you should schedule in at least, 2 to 3 times a week. You should schedule in times to see your friends. How do you see value being gained from that, and why do you think it's important?
Oh my gosh. I don't even know when I gave that piece of advice, guys. I love that you've done your research, and I'm like, I said that? That's actually pretty good advice. The value that I see in that is that not only does it allow you to maintain, like, this is something that I believe so deeply and that I've really come to understand more recently, is like, you are nothing without community. Like, there are so many issues in society where it's like one of the antidotes of many would be to improve like a sense of community, loneliness being one of them, mental health also being another, like those two coming in separately. And so I just think that being deliberate about your friendships is also important. And that is something that I see people really kind of fall off on, where they're like, yeah. And I'm not calling you out. I'm like, I also, and sometimes like, yeah, I have enough friends, but you're like, yeah, I've got my friends. We're always going to be friends. I think we're probably all lucky in that. Like, I've had friends for like 10, some of them 15 years, where I'm like, yeah, you're a sibling, right? But when you kind of get to that level of comfort, sometimes it becomes very low effort, and that doesn't always lead to the best outcome. So firstly, I think it's great for maintaining relationship. Secondly, I just genuinely think that it keeps your kind of baseline level of like needed social connection like at a healthy level. Because if you ever noticed, like, you go through periods where you're not seeing people, and then suddenly it's like a shift, a permanent shift. And I noticed this like when I finished uni, a few years back, where I finished, and then I went from seeing people every day, and then I went from seeing people not that often. And now if I was to go back into that environment where I was seeing people every day, I'd be exhausted. Doesn't mean that I don't need that connection. So I think it's like good for maintaining like a level of like a baseline level of like necessary connection and socialization that keeps you healthy. Also, it's like just kind of fun. Like, I love seeing my friends. One of my best friends, actually, and this has been one of the reasons, sorry guys, I'm rambling, but I love talking about her. This has been one of the reasons why I've been really like kind of waking up to this like community health element, is because one of my best friends, lives 2 doors down from me. And it is the best thing that has happened for my health this year, being like, okay, I'm not in this like distant state from everyone that I love. And one of my friends is like launching this website / app / I don't know, like an app, I guess. I don't even know what it is. Like a company where they help friendship groups and groups of friends like find properties near each other. And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea, because it's just like, I don't know, I think that would just be so fulfilling. Just like going on a rant. Like my new thing is this community thing, and everyone's always like, okay, but I like it.
Well, look, if it comes out, let us know. I'd love to use it. I can't lie. It could be fun. But
yeah, if it launches in the UK, I'll let you know. Actually, it's really cool.
Yeah. But you mentioned also like being at uni and seeing people 24/7. The flip side of that often, compared to needing to see friends more and having that communal aspect, is often it can be quite a lot. And you're saying yes to everything that happens around you. What would your advice be for learning to set boundaries with friends and the right way to go about doing it without upsetting anyone or making it seem like you don't want to spend time with them and so on?
Are you still at like in a college, or are you at like a share house, or I don't know how it works in the UK, to be honest.
Yeah, it's different from uni to uni. For us, basically, we have, in Oxford, you have, I think it's 42 or something, different colleges, and they kind of act like little houses. You have a set of professors. So, for example, if you do philosophy at my college, you'll have a specific professor compared to somebody who does it at a different college, and then everyone lives together. You have a hall and all that kind of thing. So there's a very much communal aspect where we are, but often there's just, most UK unis is just, you live in like a uni house a bit away from campus, and you have your friends that you live in a uni house with, and that's mostly it. And then sports teams and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's crazy. Oxford has 42 like economics professors, like 42 politics professors. God, I know who's hiring them.
Some of them are smaller and have less, but yeah,
that's
it depends.
crazy. That's so interesting. I didn't know that. In Australia, like I remember, and I think this is really common in the US as well. It's like you live on, actually in Australia, if you don't like go to uni in your state, which is not as common as I think, or in like your town, I guess, you go to like these huge residential halls. And there is like 500 people living there. There's 500 people who are the same age as you, who care about probably the same things as you, who all want to get on the piss with you, who like all want to like go and party and like kind of want to like sleep together. And it's just like this intense environment. And you're right, it gets so much. And I remember like moving out of my college to a share house, and I was like, I need to get out of here. Like this is too much, because this is a study I always pull up. It's by Robin Dunbar. Robin Dunbar is like my favorite psychology professor, psychology researcher ever. He's done so much work on like gossip, on friendship. And he was the one who was like, we max out at 150 people in our community connections, whatever, we're maxed out. And past that point, like you're not getting the same quality. And so there is a need to kind of, and also I think it was something like you can really only have like 5 close friends, and every relationship takes effort to upkeep. So I think when it comes to like setting boundaries, a good friend will understand when you need space. And it's not like the kind of space that is the end of the relationship. It's just like, I need a night in. I need to not come to that. And I remember being like in uni, even in like when I was younger and as like a teenager, being like, expressing needs to friendships is such like a catalyst for conflict. And the older you get, the more you realize, and the more you practice this, confrontation, the more you practice boundary setting. And you realize that the people who really care about you are probably also feeling similar to you, because they are more, aligned with you in like a character sense. And you realize that if someone isn't going to respect that need to like take a night off, to maybe like take a step back, that relationship is probably not going to thrive much longer anyways. So you kind of cut your losses at a point, I think. It's a bit of a learning process. I don't really have many tips for it. I guess because I don't remember doing anything deliberately, I have to think about it.
Do you tend to take like quite a direct communication style and kind of state it? Because I think often now a lot of like mental health and therapeutic language and stuff has come into the mainstream. And that's why even talking about setting boundaries is even a thing. Because I think like 20 years ago, you wouldn't even talk about it like that. I don't think you would even say that. So I guess my kind of question is, how direct are you? And do you phrase it in those terms, or do you just take it a bit more chill? I.e., are you like, I'm setting a boundary, I need to spend tonight alone? Or is it just like, I'd rather have a night in,
I think that I would be like, I use the boundary speak because like therapy speak is huge nowadays. And sometimes I think it's really weaponized where it's like, yeah, I'm setting a boundary that I don't want you to see that person anymore. It's like, that's not a boundary. That's a demand. Let's get that clear. So I think that also sometimes I shy away from like using that language because I'm like, people get icky about it. I feel like we've kind of, like the horseshoe theory, like you go so far around that you actually end up at the same point. It's like I think we're kind of getting there. Or it's like the people who really do need boundaries set with them now know how to use that term back. So I normally am just very much like, I'm going to express a need and I'm going to express what I would like. And if you push me on it, then I'm going to say, no, that's a boundary for me. Because normally I find that if expressing like, hey, this is what I would like for me, because obviously you can't control what someone else does, but you saying, well, I want to step back from these kind of conversations, like you gossiping about people. I don't want to be involved in that. I don't really want to do drugs with you guys anymore. Like whatever it is, it's like express what you want. And then if they push you, then you say that's a boundary. And I think people are really receptive to that.
I think that's a really good point. Maybe moving it on to your interactions with other people to perhaps your interactions with yourself. We could speak about journaling for a little bit. Journaling is something that Ollie and I both have done in the past and have found quite helpful. And I think it's a good way of exploring the self. Not to sound pedantic, but you also have mentioned the kind of this difference between free journaling and prompted journaling. I was wondering if you could maybe just expand on the whole concept in general.
I'm so glad you guys like journaling. When did you start doing it? Were you just like, this sounds great? Or was it just like you kept a diary as a kid?
It was partly just a therapist told me to do it. And I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago when I started doing it occasionally. It's a habit that one kind of needs to keep because it's time consuming. But maybe Ollie can also expand on his experience.
Yeah, I tried it probably a couple times in the last few years. And it never really stuck. I don't think I really knew how to do it. And I also found speaking to myself weird at the beginning. And maybe there was kind of an element of internalized masculinity of like, my sister did it and I was like, I'm not just going to sit down and write about my feelings. But then I think over the course of this year, I really begun. And then once you get into a flow, it's actually such a nice thing to do. So yeah, I'd say probably in the last year, but I've never tried prompted journaling. So maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah. Honestly, I love free flowing journaling. That's kind of my favorite, but like, you're right. You have to get into it. Like you have to build the habit and you also have to take note of the fact that you feel great afterwards. Like I always make sure I remember that really clearly. I'm like, wow, don't I feel amazing? I should remind myself of that more often than I do. But yeah, so prompted versus free flowing journaling. Prompted journaling is basically like someone else is doing the thinking for you about what you're going to write about. And if you are just like new to journaling, I think that's great because sometimes it takes so much mental energy to have to like not even just write, but to come up with the topics. And if you're like someone who's like not naturally great at like self-expression, it's like, oh my, you're right. It's like, what do I write about? Like, do I write about my day? Do I say like, dear diary? And if you think about the ways that we're typically like used to writing, it's like in response to a requirement, right? You write a report for school, you write an email response, like there is a prompt there. So I find that it's really, really good. And you can find a lot online. Like there's so many creators who do like amazing journal prompts. Free flowing journaling, I think it's not even like, you just kind of got to find what works for you. Free flowing journaling is like is like so great for anxious people because I'm just like, it's a brain dump, right? Like that's what I really find of like, I'm going to talk about all these things that are bothering me and something written on a page is always a problem halved. Then there's also things like visual journaling, which I love, like that I have friends that do that. I think also like journaling is not just contained to a pen on paper. Like people who are reading a Kindle are still reading. People who are listening to audiobooks are still taking in that information. And I think that's the same with journaling. It's like writing in your notes app is still journaling. To me, I honestly think that like writing long-winded Instagram captions is still journaling. Like it is a form of like expressing something that maybe you find hard to verbalize or that you wouldn't otherwise verbalize if it wasn't in written form. And maybe some people come at me like that and be like, I'm sorry, an Instagram caption is not a journal entry. But besides the format, like it's the same premise, you know?
I guess it kind of depends on how you take your Instagram. My Instagram captions are maybe like 3 words maximum. So
yeah, I'm
probably
not one
that
for
much.
the long-winded ones. I'm like, I'm not a big fan of that because I'm like, someone's going to eventually read that caption at some point. So
yeah, exactly. But I think for me, if I had to summarize what I thought like the benefits of journaling were for me is first of all, I think when they're just in your head, you can think kind of ridiculous things and allow yourself to think them. And once you write them out and try and put them in what's more kind of a logical structure than thought, you kind of realize, no, this is actually a stupid thing to think. And maybe the second thing for me would be like, I don't know how to explain it. I guess often we think we're acting for a certain reason, or we think we're reacting in a certain way for a certain reason. And I think journaling can help you to unpick what's actually driving you. So that would be kind of what I would say has helped me. But for people who are thinking about trying journaling, or for people who you would want to encourage to journal, what are the benefits that you would say that it brings you or that it can bring people?
I love what you said. It makes, I think if you're someone who is anxious, it like can make things feel very logical, and you're like, it's kind of like your mind is playing games with you, and you like put a brick wall in front of it. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, run into this. Like, I've just out-logicked you. I've out-thought my brain by writing it down. Like, it's like, you know, that's like the anxious thoughts terrain. And once you put them on a piece of paper, like they can't operate anymore. I also think that like, it's so great. And this is like a random side thing, but for just like memory keeping and just for like keeping track of your life and keeping track of your growth. And I really like, sometimes I almost feel sad for people who haven't documented their life, not even just through journaling, but through any means. Cause I'm like, yeah, like you have memories, but like your memories aren't always as sound as you think they are. They're not always as permanent or as objective. Whereas like you have this and you can't remember everything, you know, unless it's been recalled. And I just think that like having something like a journal, having something like a diary, like again, an Instagram or anything like that is like a great way to just be like, okay, that was me and that's who I was then. And this is who I am now. And like, wow, that's just so cool of like that change and that transformation and that evolution, giving yourself credit for it, being able to like reminisce. It's actually quite a gift in many ways. I don't know if you found that though, because I think sometimes like if you're someone who only writes during like mental health periods of like poor mental health, it's like, God, this is super down. This is just like a diary of misery. But again, sometimes nice.
Yeah, I think it depends on each person's way of journaling, and I suppose there's not one correct way. But to move it on, if you're okay with that, we'll talk about working in your 20s. And it's something you also talk about. And I think it's something which I could take a lot of advice from, seeing as I'm starting my first proper office job on Monday.
Wait, where are you starting? Oh my God, that's so exciting.
Yeah, I'm working in London. So as a salesman. So long hours, lots of intense, I think, strategizing. So
I think you'll do really well. I think you'll be fine.
First of all, thank you. And second of all, do you have any advice on avoiding burnout? Something which I actually struggle with.
Oh my God, me too. The first thing I always say to people is like, burnout is not like just one thing. It's like a 12-stage process. And when I like say this to people are like, what are you talking about? I'm like, no, the creator of burnout is like stage 13. Like there are so many things that like happen before that. So just take note of them. And, you know, I cannot remember them all from the top of my head, but there are things like, you know, you feel like physical symptoms, there's like avoidance, there's like the mental pressure that you start putting on yourself, the social withdrawal. Try and like stop it as soon as you start going down the ladder. And especially for like people who are working, I know this is going to sound like sometimes people give me like shit for this, but like, it's just a job. It's just a job. And your mental health is so much harder to reclaim than a new position. Like, if you like push yourself to a period of burnout, like it can take you like a really severe period of burnout. It can take you like years to recover from, because it's like a physical it's a physical experience. So always prioritize your mental health. And then I have this equation that I used to do when I worked a corporate job. So I used to work as a management consultant, which no one knows what they actually do. And I totally appreciate that. I honestly think the government just created the job title to like, I don't know, get people employed. But no, it's real. I promise it is real. Kinda. But it's like a notoriously long hour game, right? It's like you don't finish when the clock finishes, like you finish when you're done with your job. And the way that I used to go about it was I used to have like a formula for making sure like that my kind of soul was still nourished. And it was like 4 things. You've got to do something every day that's productive, but it can't be done with work. So it can't be like, oh, I finished that task at work. It has to be productive for you. Something social, something physical, and something personal. So it was like social, and it didn't have to be like intensive, like I need to go and have dinner with a friend. It could be like I'm going to call my mom on my commute. I'm going to, you know, at my lunch break, like send my friend a voice note, whatever. Then like the productive thing could be like, okay, when I get home, like I know I want to go to bed, like I'm going to have an everything shower. I'm going to do my dishes. I'm going to do my laundry. Same with physical. It's like just do some form of exercise. It's going to make you feel great. Even if you have standing desks, the best. And then of course, like something just for you, something that would like, you might think would make you feel guilty, like getting takeout, like binge watching a TV show, just like do something that still makes you feel happy, even if someone would say it's lazy or whatever. And that was like what I used to do every single day. And it was great. It wasn't like amazing, but it was like, okay, I'm still human. Like I'm not just this like drone who just like works a job and like has no friends anymore and doesn't take care of their body anymore and like doesn't do anything for themselves. So try and remember that formula, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. And I think it's actually kind of crazy that you get pushed back for saying it's just a job. It's like, it's kind of like people forget that there are other things.
Yeah, all the time.
And I watched it was a while back actually, I think, the podcast you did with Ali Abdal.
I was going to say, it's a goodie.
And he pushed back on you for it, right?
He did, yeah. I love him though.
Yeah, and you said actual wage, which was what he disagreed with. So maybe you could tell us what you mean by actual wage.
I still
and that it's actually more about balance. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I stand by that 100% because it's something that really grinds. Oh, also, I just will say, mad respect for Ali. Like, I love that we had that discussion because it was like, you never really think about your ideas unless someone questions them. So it was great. But actual wage, I think I didn't come up with it. It's just like a thing in the ether, sorry. But it's basically like, don't be doing so much more than what you're getting paid for. Don't be like, if there is an option there to work like extreme overtime and not get paid for it and you're getting paid $60,000 a year, like, yeah, you could climb the corporate rat race and you could get ahead and maybe someone would notice that you are doing those extra hours. Chances are they probably won't. They probably won't notice. And all it's doing is putting your life like at not jeopardy, but just kind of reducing the quality of the life you have outside of work. And I think that like people push back because they're like, no, if you want to get ahead, like if you want to be successful, if you want this, that, like you need to do those extra things. Like you have a job to do. I get it. But again, like success in your profession, maybe being the best, always being the one who's promoted first, like that's might feel really, really fulfilling for a while. But as someone who like did that, it was like eventually you need more. Like eventually you're going to have a look around and be like, focus all this effort on doing all these things for people who I was trying to impress, and it really hasn't made my life much better. So actual wage is basically act how much you're getting paid. And it's also like if there's someone in like a senior position getting paid $30,000 more than you who has the same responsibilities as you, ask for a pay raise. Like if you're doing their job, you should be compensated fairly for it. Again, I don't think that's a crazy thing to say, but people sometimes don't agree, which I get.
Do you think then with that extra time that someone has, for example, in your opinion, do you think people should then have a side hobby, or what advice would you give someone to find a passion on the side?
That's a really great question. If that's like the thing you want to do, I will say I'm doing like an episode coming up on like the psychology of hobbies, because like I'm notorious for just like collecting them and then ditching them, but it's fun because I'm like, I want to try all this random stuff. The thing that I always tell people is like, if you want to find a hobby, find your flow state. And your flow state is like, I think you guys might know this, it's like the state of just feeling uber focused, but also excited, concentrated, challenged, just like a supreme enjoyment of an activity where the time just flows by. And some people like get it when they're running, right? Some people get it when they're like making pottery, when they're like rock climbing, when they're knitting, doing whatever. Like notice the activities where time just floats by. You're really excited and absorbed by the activity. And I think that's like a great way to like discover a side passion. Also just like go and try new stuff. Like my big thing at the moment is like boxing. I was never exposed to that as a kid, but it's like, and it's weird and it's strange going and doing new things, but so is like never doing them because everyone was a beginner at some point. It's like, maybe that was when they were 3, maybe it's when they're 50. Like no one really cares that much if you're new at something or if you're making a fool of yourself. If anything, they probably want to like help you out. So a side piece of advice on that.
Yeah, I think people forget that hobbies can kind of just be fun in themselves. Like this kind of idea of generalized productivity kind of makes people think, okay, well, if I enjoy reading, you know, I should be reading a really specific kind of book, or if, you know, one of my hobbies should be exercise because I can get fitter. And I'm kind of guilty of that as well, because when I was younger, I used to get super frustrated at myself because I get super passionate about a hobby for like 2-3 months. Like when I was 12, it was the Rubik's Cube. When I was 11, it was magic. And I'd become like as good as I could for about 2-3 months. And then instantly I'd drop it and just not be interested in it anymore. But looking back, I don't know if that's such a bad thing. And then actually just doing things for the sake of doing them can actually be quite fun.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely love that, Ollie, generalized productivity. Yeah, like I absolutely love that. And it's like, as someone who turned one of their hobbies into my, like it was a side hustle and now it's my job, like you do lose love for it. So it's like you don't need to be like amazing at everything. Like it doesn't need to be a potential career. You don't need to be going to the Olympics. Like if it's not fun anymore, stop doing it.
Yeah, I think, Ollie and I also thought this podcast is a bit of fun, and now it's definitely not a career, but it's a side passion, right? And I think I wanted to move on the conversation. So we're getting to the end of the podcast. So I think moving on to 20-year-olds, Ollie and I now in our early 20s, and as I'm sure you know, the brain only fully stops developing at 25. What challenges do you think this presents for 20-year-olds compared to 40-year-olds? And what do you think some of the differences are that make our 20s so unique?
Okay, on the brain development thing, I will say I'm on the other side of that. Also, your brain does continue to develop, so don't worry. Like there's still more synaptic growth, synaptic pruning stuff to happen. But it was insane, like switching over to like 24, 25 and being like, my emotional management just got so much easier. I took everything less personally. I felt a lot more free. I felt a lot more focused. I felt a lot less like, it just felt like, I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. And it when you get there, you realize what it's like. And before then, it kind of just feels like everything is like on this like fast forward mode. And then once that like the brain finishes developing, you're kind of like, like all that stuff kind of makes sense now. I think the challenges that it poses is like, you kind of find it hard to sit still. You kind of are like still making a lot of mistakes and kind of not learning from them almost. Like I think a lot of that consolidation and solidification like only comes with hindsight and with being a little bit older. So the advice I would have is like, just take yourself a little bit less seriously. Like you probably don't even know who you are yet. You might not know what you want from your future. You probably don't really know much. And what you do think you know, you end up replacing with better knowledge. So just like, don't take it too seriously. Like, invest in experiences, invest in relationships. And like, I'm going to actually just give like a summarizing statement. Like, you're so, like, anyone listening to this who's like in their 20s, even in their late 20s, like, we're so young. And I always think of this like Reese Witherspoon, like the actress. She was like talking to this actress, and this younger actress, and Reese goes like, oh, how old are you? And she's like, I'm 29. She's like, oh my God, you're so young. And I don't know why, but that like always stuck with me. I was like, yeah, like, you really are quite young. Like, you're not even halfway through yet. You've got so much time. Like, it's okay to slow down, take your time, just figure things out.
I'm looking forward to my brain settling, to be fair, at 25. But
feels great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. But something I've kind of already noticed, I don't know if you've had this experience as well, is obviously my brain hasn't fully developed, but I'd say in the last couple years, I'd say up until recently, I kind of wasn't able to make a decision about anything like at all, in a way, even in terms of my opinions on like politics, for example, or my friendships. Like, I'm like, have they screwed me over there or not? Like, I couldn't decide. And I think now I'm able to trust my gut a little bit more and actually be like, no, okay, this is what I think. I don't know if you experienced that earlier as well, that kind of solidifying of how you feel about things.
Oh my God, like, absolutely. Now that you've said it. Also, it was like you just tried on random opinions. And it was like, this is so random. And I've never admitted this, but I remember there was like a period where I was 17 where I was like, maybe I should be a conservative. And I was like, no, like, that's not who I am. I don't like, and I just was being very like inflammatory at times. I was like, you just try different things on. And then I think you're right. Like, you're better able to be like, yeah, I've done enough exploring here. I kind of know what's right now. Like, I know or at least what I believe or I think. It's like with the friendship example of like, has this person screwed me over or not? It's like, yeah, they have. I have enough experience to know what that looks like, and I trust myself now. And I'm okay with the consequences of that rather than feeling like everything is very up in the air.
Yeah, I feel like when I was about 18, so like 3 years ago, I was discussing this with my friends yesterday, actually. I had this phase where I would really like to test boundaries with other people as well. And I think that lasted about a few months until I realized, yeah, I think this is the right place to be in terms of when to push boundaries, like to find, and then slowly I started to find where I sat politically, socially. And I think the 20s are an interesting time. We'll leave a link to your podcast, The Psychology of Your 20s, in the description so that all our listeners can go have a look at that and learn a little bit more about themselves, perhaps. But first of all, we wanted to thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. And we were wondering if you had any closing thoughts for everyone who's tuned in today.
Oh, let me think. Honestly, I'll just say like, it's okay to not have it figured out. And I know it's so simple, but like, I literally talk about my 20s for a living, and I sometimes write episodes where I'm like, I need to hear this. Like, I have no idea what I'm doing. So it's okay. Also, I just want to say you guys are doing such an amazing job. I also want to point out you have such great, leave such great space for the people who come on your interviews. And I'm so like, something I noticed is like, you guys are very good at not interrupting each other. And I don't know if that's deliberate, but sometimes you get on these calls and like everyone is like speaking over each other. And it's just like, I'm so impressed. That's my final statement. I'm so impressed, but yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. No, in terms of speaking over each other, we have a little communication tactic where we know who's speaking next. We send like a little signal in a WhatsApp chat, basically, just to make sure we don't speak over each other. But I really appreciate the comment about leaving space. We left loads of space for loads of interesting things. So thank you so much for that, Jemma, for coming on. And this has been the Loaf Podcast. Signing off. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Jemma Speg and you learned something. If you disagree with anything or you want to have a little discussion, we reply to all comments. So put down your thoughts and we'll hash it out. But make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us and you'll be able to see more discussions like this. If you want to see another video like this one with Dr. Paul Conti about trauma, you can click right here. And we'll see you guys next time.